how to push towards some newer initiatives that are going to be much, much better in the future, unit economics wise, customer experience wise, and so on. But internal machinery was hard to change, user behavior was hard to change. And somewhere, I believe that it's very, very difficult to change consumer behavior.
Welcome to another episode of The Startup Operator. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Satyaj Sirur. Satyaj is a stellar product guy. He has spent time before at Microsoft and Amazon, and then eventually headed product at Taxi for Sure from its founding to exit of 200 million in 2015. He's now the co-founder at Rocketium. Rocketium builds products that helps enterprises make hundreds or even millions of creatives in minutes. They are to Photoshop what Tableau is to Excel. In this episode, we talk about his journey, the early days at Taxi for Sure, what they did to complement and then change consumer behavior, his experience as a founder now, how he's running his company on frameworks and principles, and also building a team of outperformers with radical candor. So I can't wait for you guys to listen in to this fascinating episode. Let's get started. Hi Satyaj, welcome to the Startup Operator. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey Roshan, thank you for having me.
So Satyaj, my first question is that, you've done various roles in the last 10 years or so, right? So from being a software engineer at Microsoft, to heading product at Taxi for Sure, and then now being the founder at Rocketium. What has changed all through these years?
Yeah, it's been a longish journey and a lot of changes throughout. But I would say the last 5 years of doing Rocketium has been the most amount of change because consciously I've been looking for change, thinking about how am I going to get better and so on. So, but if I just had to break down and kind of group those three parts of my life almost. So about the first 8 or 9 years of my life was as a software engineer. The 2 years after that was the 3 years was MBA as well as management and product experience at Taxi for Sure. The remaining 5 have been in Rocketium. So if I think about that journey, and in many ways, a lot of us go through that journey, right? You are an individual contributor, then you're a manager, then you're a manager of managers. It's almost been like that. Also, I am older, so that evolution has also happened. But in many ways, it's just almost like 3 different lives. So, so the first part, like many people, good at chasing some logos and joining the right kind of companies and trying to do well, being a part of the system, going from promotion to promotion, those kinds of things. Even though that was not primarily the focus, but somewhere you end up getting caught in that cycle. So a large part of this one, and here a little philosophical, is that a large part of that process and daily decisions that I used to make were ruled by fear. It was fear of some sort, either fear of letting somebody down, letting not meeting my own expectations, or when I was in the US, I was there for 5 years. That time, this irrational fear that something I'll do, it'll not work out, I'll be let go, then I'll be sent back to India. Not that coming back to India was a fear, but it was just this overnight something will have to change and I'll have to go. So a large part of that was really driven by fear. So, and as you can imagine, when you're always in fear, you're not really, I wouldn't say not happy, but just a lot of sort of maybe a mixture of stress and some of those things. So you're not really doing as well as you can, just kind of doing what you're told. So that was really the first part of my life.
Yeah, I think you should have something to run away from, not just run towards.
Yeah, and I don't think fear is a bad thing necessarily, right? A lot of
it's the biggest motivator sometimes.
And just having spent time in all of these different parts of the world, you can see that fear is a big contributor to why in some countries you do a lot of things, and in some countries you just are okay to get away with stuff, because in India that fear is not there of what happens if you break the red light or so and so. And I've seen in the US systems completely break down when that fear goes away. Either traffic lights are not working, cops are not there. So I've seen systems completely break down and be like India and whatever we say about India. So anyway, but that part, I used to tell people that fear is a big motivator. It is something that you should keep have at the back of your mind. Create something that creates fear in you, even if it's not real. Use that.
Just a little thing that I remember, there was this experiment they ran with mice on how fast they can run on the hamster wheel, right? So on that wheel, basically. And they did three things. So one, they kept like a piece of cheese in front of the mouse. And then, they measured how fast it ran. And then what they did was, they gave a whiff of something like a predator, like a cat coming after it, and checked how fast it ran. And the optimal was when it had a cheese as well as the whiff of the predator. So something to run away from, something to run towards. Yeah,
absolutely. Really nice analogy for all of us. So in a startup, you are both trying to prevent your own demise as well as trying to grow the company and take it to the next level. So yeah, I guess we all live in that. So and then that a lot of things that would come from that fear would also be there. So you would be a little more risk averse, not really try too many things that would rock the boat and so on. The next phase was at Taxi for Sure, where in the early days, and when I'd shared with the CEO of Taxi for Sure this philosophy, he was talking about it that fear, once you let go of it, you will see how many opportunities there are that will make you want to grow, create more change around you, more impact, and so on. And I couldn't really see that at that time, and I couldn't let go of that fear. But slowly, it was transitioning into something slightly different, which was, I would say, the next 3 or 4 years were where ego was somewhere driving everything that I was doing. Where somewhere, for whatever reason, I felt that I had arrived, I had created something, I have some sort of pedigree and so on. And I felt that whatever I create, I have to be judged very positively. People have to just say that, oh, Satej has made this, it is amazing. So I wanted that, not necessarily praise from people, but somewhere I wanted like, okay, it's my output. Whatever I'm doing has to be world class and really amazing. So that was sort of what was really driving me, that phase. And so again, it, in a way, it is a negative feeling because somewhere it's not coming from some positive thing that you're trying to create in the world or anything, but it was a great driver. Because even in small things like the team that we were trying to build, it was always that sense that this team has to be the best team, not because I want to win some fictional prize, but it's my team. I'm creating it. They have to be really, really happy. I have to be the best manager. They have to really love me. Like, all of those things were really driving me.
That also happens when you tend to put everything you have into something, right? Whether it's a product, a feature that you're shipping, or building your team, or anything that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And somewhere I was trying to find out what was the motivating factor, what was driving me to do all of these things. And only in hindsight, I could see that that transition had happened, where I was afraid a little bit, but it was more that I felt I had a reputation, I had some sort of a name that I had to uphold. Right. And then that name expanded and became not just me, but people who were associated with me. It could be my company, it could be the team that I work with, and so on. So that phase of ISB as well as Taxi for Sure and first couple of years of Rocketium were more about that. Now I can slowly see a shift where fear is almost non-existent. So I am not afraid at all, which is a huge thing for me, where if I look back now, and I would say a lot of my US experience was tainted by that sort of cloud of fear, which I didn't see it at that time. But now I can imagine that anything I do, any board that I see with instructions used to create fear that, oh, I will mess up something and then some cop will come, and irrational fear. And a lot of Indians live in that sort of fear, even though nobody's racist, nobody puts you in jail, nothing. But that was there. And so that fear is completely gone. So that in turn has created an amazing feeling of liberation where I can be very honest to people very directly. I can tell them something. And a lot of entrepreneurs might be going through that, or people with that sort of entrepreneurial spirit might be going through that, where they can be open with people. And somewhere that has now melded with a sort of newer driving force. I don't know if it's still that's the one, because I think only in hindsight I'll see it. But somewhere I want to create that big impact, big change. Right. I want people around me to become better. So somewhere that is also driving that feeling that I want to be very open with people. So if I do recently we did a session with a few people, and there were organizers over there. Later, I gave feedback saying, hey, the organizer could have done these 5 things better. Now that person could be like, hey, you are doing one session. This is my business. Why are you trying to give me feedback? Like, it's my business. I'll take care of it. But somewhere I felt that person should be absolutely excellent in what they do. Not that they didn't introduce me right, or they didn't ask questions. None of those things. But somewhere I touched them. I was impacted by them. I feel they should become much better. So somewhere that impact and wanting people to become better, that is really what is driving it. So those are sort of 3 phases of my life. I don't know what the next phase holds, but I can see these sorts of clear parallels over like first 10 years, then 5 years, then another 5 years or so.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, the freedom to experiment, sort of like express yourself and be intellectually curious, right? That is like, a fantastic sort of a spurt to have, where you sort of feel like you have nothing to lose by just expressing yourself freely. And I really feel, I mean, that's one of the key drivers to doing fantastic work.
Yeah, and nobody's very few people, once you see this, it's like seeing the Matrix. A lot of these
Yeah,
hidden things that you see in the world, as more and more of these are revealed to you, you you cannot imagine. Others can't do
right.
it. Others can't say a simple thing like, hey, your mic is on mute, I can't hear you. A lot of people will just be quiet, they'll not say something. It's like so obvious and such a small thing,
Right.
right? But today I'm even able to give really brutal feedback to somebody, just sort of questioning everything about their life. Even that I can now say to people, because somewhere I know what's the driving force behind it. I'm not trying to make you feel small or tell you I'm better than you, and none of those things. I want you to be amazing. I can see something in you, piece of spinach stuck in your teeth. I can see it, you can't. Doesn't make me a better
Yeah.
person. But if I say it, you remove it, you can become better. So that's really what's driving it. So it gives you that freedom that I didn't have before.
Yeah. No, I mean, it also, I mean, people are able to sense the intent with which you're saying it, right? Most people, I would say. But yeah, I mean, you also have to kind of package it in some sort of a palatable fashion, I feel, right? Yeah. So, I mean, you were part of Taxi for Sure, which, got sold for, I think, 200 million in 2015. Um, what were the early days at Taxi for Sure? Like, how did you go about building the product function? Educate us about some of the choices that you made and so on.
Yeah, so when I was interviewing with Taxi for Sure, it was a seed funded company. This was in about February of 2013. By the time I joined, it was June of 2013. The company had just closed its Series A at that time. And at those times, B2C companies used to have a Series A of 4 million and stuff like that. The seed round was 1.5 million, which it feels like a long time ago. But even then, I think the company was still figuring out a lot of things. I don't really think there was a clear product market fit. There was not a very clear 2, 3, 4 customer segments and use cases that were figured out. But you knew something was working. There was repeatable growth. There was some motions that you could go through to create those cycles. But it's difficult to imagine how things were, how different things were in 2013. It just feels like it was right now. But very little mobile usage was happening. Everybody just wanted the call center. So even within the company, a lot of these product-led initiatives that we were trying to do were very difficult to accept. Not only because of the previous things that the company was doing, but also to, so for example, I started as a PM for the app team. I didn't join as the head of product. I was the first PM, and at that time I was the only PM. They'd had a couple of PMs before, but when I joined, I was the only PM. The idea was not for me to become head of product or any such thing. I just had to get the app out, socialize it, and get it to a certain quality level and so on. So really the big challenge internally was to give enough preference to app, because when certain amount of bookings used to come from other channels and app was just starting off, it was very difficult to move the internal machinery to get to that. So those were big challenges, and no fault of the people. Even if they allowed the app to get more bookings and get more coverage, people weren't using it. People always wanted the call center. They wanted to talk to somebody, get that assurance. So those were some big challenges that we had in the early days, that how to push towards some newer initiatives that are going to be much better in the future, unit economics wise, customer experience wise, and so on. But internal machinery was hard to change, user behavior was hard to change. And somewhere I believe that it's very difficult to change consumer behavior. And we were lucky that the experiments that we were doing, they were working, because whatever ways in which we tried to engineer user change, I didn't see that working. I'll give you a simple example. Yeah, that in north of Bangalore, a lot of times people wanted to go there. It could be office, it could be something else, and uh, cabs did not want to go there for a very simple reason. From their own experience, they are also data driven like all humans. They end up there and they find out that no bookings come from going from North Bangalore to anywhere else, so they get stuck over there. And the marketing team and the ops team always used to keep having these fights, saying that how do you get cabs back from North Bangalore? Get us demand there, get us demand there. And that was like the perennial problem for the marketing. How the hell do I get people from North Bangalore back to anywhere else? And they had tried flyers, they had tried giving coupons to people, they had done like in-person campaigns, hoardings, everything they tried, they couldn't do it. But then 6, 9, 12 months later, when secularly the demand went up everywhere, North Bangalore was still far lower demand than anywhere else. But still, secularly, as the demand went up, that problem kind of vanished. So
Right.
even with a large amount of funding and almost intuitive need for transportation to get from one place to the other, something like that should have humongous need. Even there, you could not create need if people didn't have that need. There's just no way to do that. So those were some challenges that we had. So finding a product market fit, really figuring out the customer segment, in some ways, I feel we didn't have to solve that problem, because so much latent need was there across all segments. We didn't have to do anything special to get one set of people. So I feel that learning, I don't really think I developed over there. But definitely things like really structuring the product to support various teams, because product was not the central function. It was almost incidental. That you wanted a cab, that was the product. The taxi ride was your product. The experience with the driver was a product. It
The
took
higher
us all a
purpose.
while to understand that.
Yeah.
The app, website, booking, internal logistics, operations, algorithms, they almost didn't matter, because there would be times when the system was entirely down for a variety of reasons. It would be down. People would take every booking, everything would be managed on spreadsheets, and the business would still run.
No, I mean, some of those things that we take for granted right now, right? So one thing that you mentioned just like rang so true. Back in 2012, 2013, you actually had to sell app usage to people. I mean, it sounds like
It sounds crazy
fantastical.
now. Yeah.
It sounds crazy, right? Like who would want to talk to someone in the call center right now? You
Yeah.
know, even for something like service issues or dispute resolution, you would much rather, resolve it over an app or, at best an email, right? But things like that, I mean, I think between 2012 to 2015, 16, the amount of investment that went into changing consumer behavior in India was just tremendous, right? And Taxi for Sure obviously was at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
So,
So that said, we still built a fairly. At that time, it felt like a very large team. There were 12 people in the product team, and the
right.
way we had split it also. And now that I look back, I see all of the points emerging. That today I'm like a big fan of frameworks. I'll have this very structured approach to doing something. That time
Right.
it was almost incidental that we ended up doing that, but we had created 4 verticals within the company. Within the product team. The first one was the consumer vertical, and this is where anything related to the consumer side we would focus on. This could be the app, this could be website. There was a discount engine and promotions and all of that that we had created, and a few other things. There was a supply side thing. So this is all the stuff focused on the drivers, because a very similar parallel set of products were there even for drivers. Taxi for Sure also had another stakeholder, which was the operator, because Taxi for Sure didn't directly work with drivers. We worked with operators who were aggregating drivers under them. So a set of portals and almost like a CRM come ERP sort of thing for the operators we had built up. So that was one vertical where a few team members were there. Then there was the platform vertical, where all of the logistics of all the algorithms, the analytic systems, the internal systems for booking and for managing all the dashboards, all of those things. And finally, there was a corporate vertical. So even at that stage where the company wasn't very large, we had built out the product team for a much larger scale. So we wouldn't have kept grown from 12 to 100, but those 12 would have been the same team and a really powerful platform that we would have had for the company to grow from the 200 million to a billion and more. But as fate would have it, there were other plans for us.
Right, right. No, I mean that's a story for some time else, right? I mean that was very interesting times, and I was following those. I mean very closely from very close quarters at that time. Uh, being a product person and now a founder, right? So that whole transition and stuff, how does it influence the choices you make? What are the things that you're really good at because of your product experiences, and what are some of those dark areas where that you're being influenced sort of adversely by being a product person?
As somebody who's always been in engineering, product, and those kinds of things, that was kind of a comfort area. And especially when the other areas are very different or very challenging, you have that natural tendency to stay away from those. So early days, you could kind of justify it saying that, hey, it's a purely software product. I can't do something on a spreadsheet and solve a problem for you. Like, it had to be a product, it has to be of a certain level of polish. So somewhere I justified not going out and speaking with customers, not doing enough sales, things like that, saying, oh, product has to be built, then only let me go out. And somewhere that also, remember that time I was in that ego phase, that the product had to be of a certain level. People shouldn't say like, oh, okay, looks like it is made from somebody in HSR Sector 7. No offense to HSR Sector 7, but so that is the sort of mode that I was in. So it really prevented me from learning enough about the other side of the business, being curious enough, and overcoming the challenges that I had. The good thing was I didn't have an ego about, okay, people have to pay for this, or people have to love the product on day one. Somewhere it was that I have to get to that stage where they really like the product. It makes a big difference in their life. Money and all of those things will follow. So somewhere building that product to the best of our capabilities so that it solves a problem of people. That is something that we were able to do as product people. And a lot of now what we are seeing after, so the last year and a half is what would really qualify as the real Rocketium, because that has been our B2B phase. Everything else was a sort of B2C thing that we are doing. So in the last year and a half, all the learnings from those times and the real hardcore problems that we solved are coming to bear fruit today, because today we are able to go out, have really powerful conversations. Global customers are saying this is exactly the sort of thing that we want. And so not focusing on business at that time possibly could have helped in possibly has led to some of this. Because if you had said that, no, on day one you have to pay me and you have to pay only this much, and I will build whatever you want as long as I get money out of it. Because that didn't happen, we had built over time pretty powerful platform. We didn't want to do 1:1 building for a customer. We said, okay, does this make sense for a larger roadmap that we have? That really helped. Also, because as product people, and also like I was telling you, I started developing this a fetish for these frameworks and roadmaps and things like that. Back in 2016, even when we were doing B2C stuff, we had this roadmap, and my co-founder also is a product and analytics person. So we had created this roadmap back then. A lot of it is coming to bear fruit today. A lot of what customers we thought would want back in 2016, customers today are telling us those things. And we know some of the things that we had planned then, we'll be building in 2021 and 2022. So it really helped us think about the next 5-10 years on day one, even when there was very little to go on. There was really, the industry was at a very different phase. There was not really any competition or people talking about this industry or any such thing. So being product people, it really helped to see the future and slowly make it happen.
So you didn't really make the transition from build to sell. I mean, rather, from what I hear, I mean, you just built diligently as product people do, and sales is sort of incidental, right? I mean, now some of the startup founders or operators listening to this are like, salivating hearing this. So how did that happen?
Yeah, and I just want to warn that I'm not saying that this way of doing it is good. I am, in fact, to anybody, a lot of my business school friends who want to start up or other entrepreneurs reach out quite often. I tell them, don't do as I did, do as I say, because I don't think this is the right way to go about it. Again, I had the hubris of the fact that, Taxi for Sure, because of it had reached a certain stage, I used to be called to speak at events and mentor CEOs and advise VC firms and all of those things. So I felt I was somebody. I had also made money from the exit. So I said, okay, let me just build whatever I wanted and not worry about how big the market is. And somewhere reading a lot of TechCrunch and really drinking that Kool-Aid of the B2C side of things, I felt I should just build the product, get it to a certain level of quality, then magically customers will come. And you read that so many times, it's ingrained in you that build and they will come will not happen. But you still
Yeah.
make those mistakes. And I'm telling people, please don't do it. Please find a customer persona. Please focus on one use case. Please solve a problem for them or validate the problem before even building. And today we are finally living those.
No, it's also a question of scale, right? See, the thing is that I feel the key difference between B2B and B2C is the fact that how many people you can get in front of with the resources that you have, right?
Yep.
With the sort of product that you have, I mean, you might have to probably reach 1,000 or 10,000 people to get product market fit on the B2C side.
Yeah.
But then B2B, I mean, it's a walk down HSR layout to meet 30 people, right? 30 companies.
And if you don't even do that, which is what and I would tell you that I have spoken with enough people, but the way I conducted those interviews, what I wanted to hear from it, and what they were saying, those were mismatched. And a lot of times, as a product person, I had that arrogance, and you could say that arrogance was completely, not misplaced, because now a lot of those things are coming true. But it was arrogance in that.
So you have to read the higher purpose, I suppose.
Yeah, and even though I said I read that and I said that, hey, this will come to pass, they just don't know it yet, they will come back to us. Many of those have become customers. But if I think about it, my co-founder being here when he could be doing any sort of role anywhere else, right? A smart person from IIT, the rest of the team, really smart people, many of whom will finish 5 years with us. Somewhere I feel that responsibility that I had of figuring out product market fit, building a strong business that is growing. If it had been done 2 years earlier, their learning, their growth, everything would have been very different. So somewhere I feel that was arrogance on my part to say that, hey, customers don't know well enough. They will turn around a few years from now and come back to us. I don't think that was right. I think we should have really nailed down what the problem was and solved that first. And some of that arrogance of building something out and then proving them right a few years later, I don't think that was the right thing. So today we are fixing that. A lot of strong ideas that we have now, which we know will bear fruit very soon once customers are ready. We have actively taken that decision not to build it. So we have done prototypes every quarter. We do hackathon. So in hackathon, we actually built something. The team was very excited. They thought, like usual, Rocketeam will start building out another product. We will, start giving it out in the market and stuff, and then see who wants it. And I was absolutely firm. Let's do it in a hackathon. Let's have fun over here. But I'm not spending even one man day of effort on something unless I know 5 customers want it. So today we are evangelizing. Yeah. So today we are evangelizing this. I'm putting it in my pitch deck. I think this is an important direction in which the company will grow. This expanding circles in which we will grow. This is the vision. But I'm not spending any time on it.
Right. No, I mean, it's so here's how I see it, right? I mean, I think it's important to have that feedback loop. Not just important, I think it's critical, right? It's a must have. But then how you read that feedback is very, very, very important as well, right? People kind of take it at the lowest level of abstraction, saying that, okay, this person said this, so that means, I mean, he wants this feature or something of that sort, right? Like, Henry Ford is famously quoted as having said, if I had asked what people wanted, they would have said faster horses.
Correct.
Right. So, kind of reading that, reading that higher purpose is what separates the truly great product folks from just the average people as there.
Correct. So today, I would say I have transitioned a fair bit from this ego thing, where even though all of us are very self-aware, we are, we'll make all these jokes that, hey, I know I don't think I'm Steve Jobs, and so I'm not going to do some stuff like Steve Jobs. But somewhere we all act like we are Steve Jobs and Henry Ford. We think we know better than somebody. We think that building a feature that a customer asks is somehow beneath us. Hey, we are not a quote-unquote services company. Why would we do something? When somewhere our team also had that arrogance, saying that, why are we building so and so feature? One customer asked for it. Why are we building? We are not a services. As if services company is a bad thing. You're solving a problem for a customer. There's nothing more that a product person should want, that a technology person should want, than to solve somebody's problem.
Yeah.
If somebody really, really wants you to solve that problem, it's one person. Just solve that problem. I'm sure if that one person has that problem, you will find 100 people who will have that problem.
Yeah,
So
no, I
they,
mean, and product folks always have this bias against services, right? Um, but I mean, if you look at a B2B company, for example, right, even Rocketium, plenty of the services stuff that you do can be productized, right? Literally,
absolutely look
your
at,
product roadmap can be, things that customers have deployed already, right? That you think that could be useful for multiple people.
and
That's it.
today 80% of what we are building are features that our customers have asked for.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
there is that visceral reaction in the team saying, hey, we have become a services company. We're just building features that people. Then I give them example after example saying that, hey, this company had asked us for it and we built it. That time we evaluated and felt that it could be a good addition to the platform. A month later, 3 more customers have had that exact same need. It was
Yeah.
impossible to predict this feature unless this first customer told us. But now 4 people are using it. And so example after example, as we do it, I call that out to my team because they have that aversion, because we almost, that very stark transition we did from B2C to B2B, where hardly anything people are paying us, or paying us $19 a month, and then we are going to them and saying, sir, please tell us what we can do for you. We are watching recordings of them using the product, using analytic funnels and all of those things, heat maps, to figure out where are they clicking, where are they not clicking, trying to predict what feature they are asking us. And here you have large businesses, global enterprises saying, I want X feature. And you're saying, oh, we won't build it because we are not services. I mean, just the arrogance of it is
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. So, I mean, I sometimes have this conversation with engineers, and I ask them what percentage of Salesforce, or some name a company, right?
yeah,
Like typical product or platform company, what percentage comes of their revenue comes from services. They're really surprised to know, even now, 10, 20 years after their founding, 20-30% of their revenue
exactly.
comes from services, right? And
Yeah.
at that scale, you can't even imagine. um, so yeah, I mean, so you mentioned that you have a tightly knit group at Rocketium, right? Uh, how do you hire these people? How do you identify operators to work at early stage startups? And what are those key things that change uh, between, let's say, employee number 4 and employee number 400?
Yeah. So when we hire, I wouldn't say we have a very sort of very nicely codified way of hiring, and slowly we are starting to put some of those things, especially to get rid of any sort of implicit bias and so on.
Hmm.
But I would say in the last 5 years, as we have done hiring, some sort of pattern has emerged. So one is, for most people, I don't know which. I'm not saying I don't care, but for the most part, I don't remember which company they have worked at before, what school they have gone to. It, like, almost never I remember some of this, because that's not an area that we look at. Somewhere we know that, okay, these are the skills that you have. We validate you having those skills. We check for culture fit, how you're approaching certain things, and hygiene stuff, like, hey, why did you leave that previous company? Did you leave because they weren't listening to your feedback? There was some sort of mismatch between your culture, or did you never even raise those problems? Because we tell people, when you're joining here, you are a founding team member, and we give those kind of points you keep making to people. Even very explicitly, we had given like a bunch of diaries to people. We called everybody founding team members. We told them, update your LinkedIn if you want to say you're a founding team member. And as we are making big changes to, let's say, for example, this time we have put in place career paths for various teams. And we have shared a draft of that saying that, hey, how would you like the career path to be? How can we make it better? This is our pitch deck. What can we do better? So you are founding team members. You are going to be giving feedback and help us improve at every one of these stages. Once you come in, you will not like certain things. But we are making the commitment, not that we are perfect today, but we are okay and we want to get better. So if you have never tried to make your previous company better, then you will not want to make this company better. Or if you had tried but they didn't listen, just know that we will not be those kinds. So somewhere we try to drill that into people. I wouldn't say we have figured out who are operators and who are just listeners and team players sort of thing. That we haven't figured out, but somewhere we try to push that right from the first conversation. We are telling them that your career is important. Even after you leave Rocketium, our worth is going to be measured by how much better you are after you have left than keeping you here forever. That's really not the goal. But if you leave, you should be a lot better than when you came. Somewhere we want you to be selfish. So a lot of those things we try to talk about during the hiring process. not check for are you from certain kinds of schools, or have you been in certain kinds of companies. So that sort of is broadly the process that we follow. And a few other things that we look for is, one is just basic smartness, because one thing we've figured out in people who've not worked out is, somewhere if you are not just sharp when somebody's telling you, and by the way, we don't test for this with puzzles or any of those things. We really don't do any of that. At
How
the same
fast the
time,
horse can run around the, those kind of stuff.
how many balloons can you fit in something? I mean, yeah,
How
those
many
are
people
good.
it takes to screw a light bulb?
Yeah, those are good questions. It will tell you some smart people, but somewhere smartness is more about, as I'm telling you something, are you able to autocomplete? If I'm asking you something
Yeah.
a little beyond, I'm asking you till n, and can you figure out n plus one? Right.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things we try to look for, more softer way of smart. But that is one thing. We also don't ask for specific knowledge that people have. It's more around problem solving and something real. So a lot of our interviews focused on making people do something real that they would do at Rocketeer. So even some of the interns that we had hired this time, they said this is a very different interview process, because other people ask us knowledge questions. Now, what is so and so technology or things like that? Whereas you guys gave us a problem. You didn't check whether we copied that thing or any of them. You asked us questions based. It's just very different. So those
no,
are
that just blows my mind, right? I mean, it's 2000. I mean, it's 2020, and people still ask questions that can be like Googled or, even Wiki, for example, right? So
you should in fact check for Googling skills of people, not whether
Exactly.
they know things that.
Yeah. So this is closely related to what I was going to ask you, which is, as an organization, right? How do you define culture? What are some of those things that help develop this culture? Any anecdotes or stories that you can share?
Yeah, so just it's a cliche thing, but we actually did a big exercise to define our culture code. We call them prime directives, as a nod to Star Trek. And by the way, in case you didn't know, the word enterprise of enterprise software comes from the Star Trek ship that they are in.
Right.
It's an interesting story. You should just look that up. So I'm glad that we are in that business of Star Trek software. But so what we call prime directives, again, the founding team members created it. 25 of us, we broke ourselves into 3 groups. We said, these are the ways in which we want to behave. But more importantly, these are the things that we already do. Let's codify it. Let's write about it, because you could print all the posters, give t-shirts, mugs, bags with those things printed.
Yeah.
But if every day you're not already living it, then it's very difficult to change people's behavior into doing those things. So that is one thing that we did. So today our culture is just all the things that we keep doing on a daily basis, right? Just the way somebody writes a message, the kind of emoji that you would put. So there is a big emphasis on being positive and optimistic in the company. So, and this is a very interesting exercise. Whoever you should do it, Roshan, and listeners should try it.
Sure.
Their phones will show you the most recent emoji that they are using, and just see the kind of emoji that you are using. It will tell you a lot about the kind of person you are. And try that exercise for your company also. Just see the top 10 most common emoji that people use. It will tell you the mood that people have, the tone that the company has. And funnily, for each one of our culture code that we have emoji to represent it. Just because the words are difficult to remember, but the emoji is easy to remember. So that's how we have defined it. But really, our culture is about every day being a certain way. And most important, the one single most important thing for us is, how can we become better every day? That is the number one thing, because everything else can be fixed if you have a solid fundamental, some sort of a base foundation, and the will to keep improving every day. So that's one very important thing. Even if it's 2 days of some activity, we ask for feedback saying, hey, how did we do? Can we do better? Not like some survey every time, but even in ad hoc conversation. Hey, we did this open house. Can we do better next time? We did this hackathon. How can we do better? So that is one thing that we do. So somewhere we keep trying to drive that point that, one more thing I'll tell you, right? We just did our appraisals this time. Told everybody we can't actually give you the salary hike until we reach a certain revenue milestone, profitability, some of those things, which should happen in the next couple of months. But in that, we give ratings to people. Now, these ratings we have defined as starting with S, which is exceptional, A, B, C, and F. So B is doing what you are supposed to do, and just sort of or average, or meets expectation, that kind of it. And that is B for us. So I know different companies might be doing something similar, but at least for us, it was very clear that we want to call it out as B. So you feel that pinch when I call you a B player. Because you'll
Right.
say, I did everything. Everything I'm supposed to do, I did. I said, yes. That's
Yeah.
why you're B. That is average. That is what is the base expectation. You should be better 6 months from now than you are today. If you're not, you will get a B. And so
Right.
when people have that ego, they get pain. They say, okay, I have to become, how am I going to become far better 6 months from now? So I'm not a B. So these are small ways in which we try to reinforce these points.
Yeah. No, that's such an important point that you mentioned, right? Because doing what you're told is just not enough, actually. Because oftentimes, I mean, you just have to take it from, not just 0 to 1, from 1 to 10, right? And you have to be able to see it, you have to be able to execute it as well. And the culture thing, right? To me, I mean, and I've said this on the podcast before, it just comes down to trade-offs. Because in
Yeah, man,
ideal
all
time,
of these,
everyone wants to be fast, everyone wants to give like
exactly.
solid quality, everyone wants to be sincere, honest, everything, right?
You write these culture principles, they all
Yeah.
seem like motherhood and apple pie. Nobody will argue against
Exactly.
them. Like
Yeah,
move
yeah.
fast, win
Who
with
doesn't want to be
speed.
that? Yeah,
Everybody wants to do it, but
yeah,
every one of those
yeah,
is a trade-off against something else.
yeah. No, I mean, think about pace of growth, right? If you're growing at such a rapid pace, how can you like prioritize quality, more than required, right? So, or up to a platinum standard. Some of these trade-offs are like super difficult, and I think like culture is what implicitly communicates this to your team, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Sathej, let's do a rapid fire round. Just quick answers to some of these questions. You can even unpack that in further detail.
Sure.
Um, so, most delightful feature you've consumed.
What is yours? Why don't you tell me? Maybe it will give me some ideas.
I'll tell you what I think. One of the and again, I mean, this might seem like plain speak at this point of time, but I just love that you can just like click one button and save things to Pocket. You
Oh
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I mean, it's just so simple, so intuitive. No opening up a tab, save to bookmark, and then fishing it out of that and stuff like that. I love that. I love how Swiggy solves its service issues. For example, right, 3 taps and you're done.
Yep.
Right. And again, I mean, they figured something which is like such a no-brainer. If a customer is spending, like, say, let's say $500, $1,000 a week, hesitating to give him like a $50 refund is just stupid,
Right.
right? So yeah, I mean, those are a couple of things that immediately come to mind.
Yeah,
But just yeah,
I would say that what I find most delightful is somewhere where it's intuitive, it's obvious, it should be like that,
yeah,
but you
yeah,
didn't expect them to do it. A simple example is in Slack, when I'm pasting plain text from somewhere into Slack, it
mm,
figures out the formatting and sort of does some
yeah,
autocomplete this that. So, for
yeah,
example, there are times when I would have just written in some other software for whatever reason, I would have written at and somebody's name and just while making notes. When I
mm,
paste it into Slack, it figures out the names of those people and kind of just tags them properly or
yeah,
hash something I would have done. It makes that into chat. So these are small things that Slack has done that make you realize that okay, somebody has been thinking about
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
something that they wanted and they solved that problem. You put
yeah,
hash and some color code, it puts a small square with that color over there. I mean, these
right,
are really useful and powerful things, and those kinds of things really delight me. The Nokia phone used to delight me like that. That there would be simple, obvious things that you'd be like, I don't know how this problem would be solved, but let me
mm,
try this. This feels like the most obvious way to solve it. And
yeah.
when I press that button, that thing would happen. That would really delight me usually.
Yeah, I mean, it's the more I think about it, right? It's not those fun-do, out of the world, innovative features or whatever. It's the small things that you think should have always been like that, but the 9 out of 10 times it isn't like that, and somebody has just
Right.
put their thought into it, right? So
Right.
yeah. So okay, question two. This can be contentious to especially if your team is listening to this. Who can be more frustrating to work with, engineers or MBAs?
It's difficult. Uh, okay, why don't you tell me? What don't you like about both of them?
uh, See, I'll preface this by saying that both have done a crossover, right? It isn't as bad as, let's say, 12 years back when I started. when engineers were so thick-headed that they wouldn't understand anything about business, and to them it was all code, code, code.
Yeah.
They've certainly crossed over, right? I mean, look at the whole product culture that we have in Bangalore, for example, right?
Yeah.
Places like Taxi for Sure, etc., definitely aided all of that, right? And you've seen that evolution,
Right.
And I've also seen MBAs become a lot more technical as well, right? I mean, it's no longer just slides and
Right.
whatever. At least they should know what the hell APIs are,
Yeah.
right?
But see,
So
both of us, that's the problem. Both of us are looking at the positive side of things. We're not able to find the frustration. But one thing that I will tell you is that at least the stage of life that I'm in, the mindset that I have, I find somewhere on the engineering side to be things to be a little frustrating because um, they readily accept and they say, okay, let's do it. Either they are excited to solve a problem or they say that, sure, you have thought more about this, let's go ahead with it. But somewhere I want to push back, somewhere I want somebody to further my own thinking. So directly accepting and doing something, I feel I don't get an opportunity to learn.
wow,
So if
you're
you push
working with
back and
angels, dude.
really, I mean, I don't get any pushback. And it's
Wow.
not for because I'm very forceful or any of those. Somewhere they're like, sure, this makes a lot of sense. Let's do it. I said, no, but you need to make it better. Like, how do we do? Just say no more. Just yeah. So yeah, I would
Yeah.
say that if anything frustrates me, I think it's that. But otherwise, I think you are spot on. Both sides have really blurred the lines. Everybody is should just see some of the when you say MBA, I think you mean more business folks in general. We
Business
don't have
folks, yeah.
many MBAs, but the business folks in our company, they are talking JSON and can I send this thing to the web callback, and again they are running this thing in Lambda. What should they do? I mean, they are very, very technical, and not because they're forced to do it. They actually enjoy it. They want to go into the weeds. They are debugging our customers' problems. You are like, guys, their developers should be doing it. You don't have to do this.
Yeah. No, I mean, we had this credo, at this place that I worked at, I mean, 10 years back. If a business guy doesn't know enough technology, or a technology guy doesn't know enough business, there's no way they'll succeed.
Right.
Because of the space that you're in, right? So, okay, moving on from that. This is again interesting. B2C consumer internet in 2013 or B2B SaaS in 2020?
I think SaaS, man. I can't think of B2C anymore. It just I cannot imagine B2C companies succeeding at the sort of scale that B2B companies can succeed. I mean, I can tell you more, but I think you're already on the same page.
Yeah. No, I mean, I could not agree more. I think the SaaS wave is just getting started, and I think it'll be order of magnitude more. It'll peak order of magnitudes more than the consumer internet wave. Is what I feel.
And consumer internet will be order of magnitude harder to crack than it was back. Yeah, it will just get harder and harder. B2B will be harder for sure, but the scale will be much, much bigger.
Right. That base level of services has been solved in consumer internet, I feel, like from a service perspective, right? Whether it's cabs or food or whatever it is. I mean, you can kind of recollect how it was in 2012, 2013. Literally, there was an app for a service,
Basic point is, as a consumer internet company, consumer app, whatever problem you're trying to, doesn't matter what problem it is, you are still vying for that 15 minutes of this person's time.
Correct.
After everything else has been taken out of their day.
Yeah.
As a B2B company, you are vying for 8 hours of their time, or 4 hours, let's say, because 4 hours is spending meetings. But it's a 4 hours of the time you're fighting for, and they have nothing else to do except your software.
Yeah. So, fantastic point.
Yeah.
Fantastic point. Yeah. Okay. So this next question is going to betray your implicit bias. Okay, whether you're a product person or more of a business person. Let's see. Who would you pick, Satya Nadella or Jeff Bezos?
I think Jeff Bezos.
Okay.
I worked at both companies. Jeff Bezos, Satya Nadella, I've not had a chance to see Jeff Bezos several times having lunch in the cafeteria together.
Right.
At that time, he seemed like a normal man. After I left, everybody was saying he's the second Steve Jobs, and now his stature and wealth and influence and all of that is far, far bigger. But one thing that I'll tell you was something that my colleague used to say. He was on the management side that time. As an engineer, I didn't really think about any of these things, or it didn't matter. But a
Mm.
very interesting thing that he said that when he was an engineer, it was like he was walking on the street and he had that perspective of what he could see in his 30, 40 feet radius around him. But
Mm.
his manager is like somebody who's on a building, so he can see a much wider radius, maybe at lesser detail, but he can see a much wider radius. He has a very different scope. And then he was
Right.
talking about specific people who, and that time both of us were in AWS. He was talking about this so and so guy who's my manager, who's the VP. He has this perspective. He's on a helicopter, and then the other people that he named today, they are on Jeff Bezos's S team, which is that senior leadership team. To
Mm.
20, 30 people were there, right? Three of those people in his leadership chain, they are on that S team. And you are like, those people can see, like, this guy is on, like, in space somewhere. He can see the entire planet and several planets. So if Jeff Bezos is operating with such people, he's been able to create that sort of leadership. It's just remarkable how many
Yeah.
massive, like, Fortune 20 companies he has been able to create within his business. It's just amazing. Satya
Yeah.
Nadella, of course, just incredible what he has been able to do. The Microsoft that I joined is such a different place than what it is today. And being able to, as an insider who's been there, like, far before when I even left,
Mm.
to changing the perspective of all of the insiders from such a difficult company to be at, because they thought they were the best at everything they had to redo. They didn't
Right.
want to use even date and time that other people use. They wanted to create everything of their own. So
Right.
it's amazing what he's been able to do.
No, I mean,
Yeah,
both these
Jeff Bezos.
companies, right? I mean, the level of scale that they operate in, and they've been, the also the amount of dexterity they've shown in, products or businesses is remarkable, right? So I was talking to Balaji Srinivasan yesterday, and he had this point about, Bill Gates having seen the internet before it became the internet, right? Before a lot of us realized, and really going hard with Internet Explorer, so it's just phenomenal, like the scale and complexity of these companies as such, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if you were to pick one, founder or operator?
I mean, I want to say founder, but I think the world doesn't need um, so many founders. The real work is happening from all the operators. I think, if anything, everybody needs to have that founder mentality, take more ownership of what they're doing, really ask questions, push back. But really, all the work is happening from the operators. Again, not trying to sound humble or any such thing, but really all the work that is happening, whether it's revenue generation or creating the culture, or all of those things, are happening from the operators in the company. Founders are somewhere lucky that they find the right people and get out of the way, and then they are doing all the being outside and motivating other people,
Yeah,
raising funds, those
that's
kinds of
being very kind to operators. But yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, right? So at some level, a founder's job is to assemble the right people and enable them.
right.
So yeah, okay. The best founder or operator that you know of?
It's tough. I'll
You
say
can give me
one
a top
person.
two if you
Yeah.
can't
One
pick both.
person that I'm really fond of and somebody I highly, highly respect is this person called Hari. He's the head of HR at Big Basket. Just the level at which he operates, the number of projects that he's able to do at the same time. He's advising several VC firms. He's a mentor to multiple startups. Plus, he has a full-time job as HR head of almost 25,000 people at Big Basket. On a
Wow.
dime, he was able to change his personality from a very introverted, reticent, intellectual kind of a person to this extremely outgoing, very, very popular person. He's LinkedIn top voice year after year, and speaking at events, and just a very, very, very smart person. Just somebody I really like, and very clear thinking. In many ways, I try to emulate how he behaves, how he would do things. He's as close as anybody comes to me. Comes for me to Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek.
Wow, that's a high compliment. Most underrated skill in a startup?
As a technical skill,
Not technical. I mean, you could. I don't want to call it soft skill. It kind of diminishes it. Um, just overall,
yeah.
like
So
most underrated character, most underrated trait.
I'll,
Let's say.
I'll pick two. The first one I would say is communication. I
Hmm.
think if you are good at communication, I think a lot of your flaws, I mean, if you're obviously first, you're a nice person and you're smart and all of those things, but if you're an excellent communicator, I think a lot of your flaws will go away, because you can tell a good story, you can get to the point quickly, you can say things in a way that people remember, they have the right takeaways. You can be good at pitch decks, you can be good at marketing collateral, your sales emails will be better, LinkedIn requests will be better. That is an amazing power to have. If you're good at
Yeah.
communication, and all kinds of communication, every one of them is difficult and different, but long form, short form, copywriting, if you're good at communication, you'll be so much better. And nobody teaches that. I don't think many people value it. It's just a shame. I think more people need to do that. The other thing, and I was just telling this to my wife this morning, so I'll just share with you that empathy is something that we don't realize how powerful it can be. And I'll tell you, I don't want to sound like one of those gurus, so I'll tell you specifically what I mean. There is a show called Hannibal. I don't know if you've watched it, heard of it.
No, not quite.
It's based on Silence of the Lambs and those that book series.
Okay.
There is a character called Will Graham. He's an FBI consultant. He has the ability to get in the mind of the serial killer and envision what that person really did before he did the crime, or why they did the crime, and where this person, everything, because they are perfectly empathetic. They can get in the shoes of any person, imagine why they are behaving a certain way, and how they can connect with them.
Yeah,
If you
that's
have
a
that
super
skill,
skill.
it's
Yeah.
it's a superpower. If you have that, you can know when you're giving appraisal feedback to somebody, how are they feeling. You're
Right.
going to a prospect, you know what problem. If you have empathy, if you can put yourself in the shoes of that person, it takes 30 seconds. Before a meeting, before a talk, you're giving a talk. Imagine what the audience wants to hear. If you know what the audience wants to hear, you can say only that to them. So I think that's an amazing skill to have as a founder, as somebody who's pitching to so many people. If you're able to figure out exactly the pain points, the challenges that the other person has, I mean, it's an amazing skill. But yeah, communication, empathy, in a way, so they are related, because what do you do after you have that empathy? You have to communicate. So I would rate communication high.
Yeah. No, I mean, both the skills that you picked, right? I mean, both are geared towards lending more clarity, right? Which I think is like
and it's ultimately, all of it is
the
about
ultimate skill.
psychology.
Yeah.
Because you need to understand the psychology of a person, make sure that they want to do what you want them to do for whatever reason. You're trying to motivate them, you want them to invest in you, buy your company's products or whatever it is. If you understand them and you communicate to them in a way that they appreciate what you're trying to do, then you can get them to do what you want them to do.
Yep. Okay, moving on. The best quarantine hack that you can suggest?
Yeah, so one thing that I can suggest is that stick to schedules. If you didn't do schedules before and regular timings, create those, because in this chaotic madness and things being all over the place, those can be real anchor points around which your entire team can build that sort of stability. So, for example, Rocketium has a lot of these fixed timings for stuff, right? 8 a.m. doesn't matter what happens, we do a daily stand-up. 8:10, 8 a.m. is the product stand-up. 8:10 is the business stand-up. 8:30 is the on-call meeting. These are all 10-minute meetings, but it gives you that incredible stability, saying, I don't care what else is going on. I know the company will do this at this time. Every month on the 31st, 30th, whenever the month ends, we do an open house. So they know 1 week before that this guy is going to send a survey. You're going to have to fill it. So if you start adding these kinds of processes, you follow those, the world could be chaotic. You might not be getting funding. Customers might be churning. Anything on the outside the four walls could be changing. But these things will bring that stability. You know that, okay, I'm at least doing these things. You get that sense of micro accomplishments. I think that's a very good hack that people can follow.
Yeah. Schedules just reduce ambiguity, right? Either, even on the personal front or whatever, knowing that you have to do a particular thing at a particular time, it just lends a lot more clarity, reduces ambiguity. I can't agree more with what you said. So what books are you reading at this point of time? What podcasts are you listening to?
So right now I'm
hopefully you start listening to this one.
yeah, of course. So that's the plan after this one. So the book that I'm listening to right now, I'm not reading because as I'm driving, I listen to books. Is Impossible to Inevitable. It's not as nice as I thought it would be. Just a big fan of Jason Lemkin and his writing. This book, the narration is terrible, but the book also is not really up to par compared to what I was expecting. But just before this, I finished Enlightenment Now. I really enjoyed that book. It's just, again, something I strongly believe in, just positivity, science, rationality, and the power of humanity. I think it's really powerful. Enlightenment now is something that I'll highly recommend. Even the voice narration of that is really powerful. And one other that I finished maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago is this book called It's Your Ship.
Mm.
It's about this retired Navy, very senior person in the Navy who was owning he was the commander of this very large ship, and how he brought in certain management principles over there that completely turned around that ship and made it literally the best ship in the Navy. Across multiple metrics, they became the very best, and happiness ratings and performance of various teams and so on. So it's a very, very nice book. A lot of very tactical tips that you can take, even though it's a very different operating environment. A lot of tactical principles that we can take away.
Very interesting. So the thing I realized about the Jason Lemkin book, right, and I took an inordinate amount of time to finish it as well, because I was reading and rereading some of these things. You can't go from start to finish, because
maybe that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. So various sections are relevant at various points in time, right? There was a whole customer success section that I skipped for quite a while, and that I picked up on, just recently, because, here we are in the situation where I feel that, customer marketing is going to become a huge priority, right?
Yep.
Not just from a retention perspective, but even from a growth perspective. So I feel like various sections of the book are relevant at various points in time, and I think you should pick and choose. It's not a start to finish kind of a book.
Yeah, maybe that's what is happening. Yeah. And the narration doesn't help. That person is just...
Yeah, the narration. So, yeah, so many of these books, right, I just find the narration just makes or breaks the book. Yeah. Seriously. Yeah. Okay, we're nearing the end of the podcast. It's been amazing talking to you.
Roshan.
Yeah. So what are some of the words of advice you have for founders and operators listening to this podcast, especially, given the times that we're living in? How can they stay focused and execute better?
Yeah, I think one thing that has really, really helped me is more and more customer conversations, and this doesn't include exactly the people whom you are serving right now, but even slightly adjacent. So this could be a time when a lot of people have time. If you are able to get those meetings, get those discussions, more broad conversations you could have. As a founder, people give you a lot of importance. They give you a lot more information than somebody else who they could perceive as trying to sell. So this could be a great way for you to figure out 2-3 more completely new opportunities for your business. Also understand more about the industry and just stay in touch with what's happening. If they happen to be users and they talk good things about you, it's also a nice ego boost. But definitely find this time to block time in smart people's calendars, talk to them, try and understand what's happening in the industry, see how you can help them. I think that will be a really nice use of everybody's openness to webinars and those kinds of things.
No, I could not agree more. Sometimes I feel this podcast is just a ruse to have an hour-long conversation with people that I admire, and learn from. So,
thanks.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much, Satej. These were some fascinating insights, and I'm sure that people listening to it will go back with a lot of valuable points that they can think about and reflect. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Roshan. Nice being here.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Startup Operator. Every weekend, we'll interview operators at fast-growing startups and curate insights that can help you do better. This podcast is available on all popular platforms. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe and share. Thank you. Until next time, put your head down and execute.